You may notice that the background is pretty bright green because we're going to learn today about John Fitzgerald Kennedy, not only a son of Massachusetts, but the first Roman Catholic president or an Irish Catholic president of the United States, which is a pretty big deal, especially to people around here. John F. Kennedy has a strong connection to Boston. Born in Brookline, had a summer home in Hyannisport, Cape Cod, and an amazing Boston accent. He was also beloved by many because he had a very photogenic young family and a gorgeous wife, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy there in the picture. And down here he is with his son, John, who, if he were alive today, would be my age. I kind of had a crush on him in the 80s. Look at this picture. There he is on Cape Cod with just a few of his nieces and nephews and children. He was young, he was attractive, he was a war hero. He captured the attention of the American people. During World War II, he served in the Navy, and his ship was bombed by the Japanese. He swam, in his mouth, he held the life jacket of one of his fellow sailors, swam to an island where he wrote a message on a coconut, gave it to a friendly native who then took it to American naval forces on another island, and he was rescued. Because of this action, he suffered lifelong lung problems from inhaling some of the diesel fuels, as well as problems from a broken back, which the injuries he suffered for the rest of his life. The Kennedy administration, after he died, was referred to as Camelot. Camelot comes from the stories of King Arthur, and in the early 1960s, it was a play on Broadway where everything was beautiful and bright. And after he died, his wife Jacqueline said, "Things will never be that beautiful again." So the election of 1960, and you can see the link there, I'm going to put on Google Classroom for you, pitted him against his Republican opponent, who you may recognize a little bit older as Richard Nixon. He was the youngest man ever elected president at 43 years old. We know that my hero, Teddy Roosevelt, was younger when he took office, but he became president after McKinley died. If you notice this picture, this was the first debate to be televised, and Kennedy wisely chose to have makeup so that he looked tan, assured, and calm, and Nixon sweated profusely and didn't handle the lights of the television cameras very well. So there is former Vice President Nixon, who served as vice president under Eisenhower, versus Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts. If you look at this map, once again, we have some of the southern states pulling out and not voting for the main candidate because of civil rights issues. But as we're going to see, Kennedy wasn't particularly well known for civil rights positive stances. It wasn't until later in his term that he began to realize that more needed to be done for African American citizens. I am always reminded of the story. I was born on January 19th, 1961. And as you may know, January 20th is Inauguration Day. And my mother tells a story of watching the inauguration on TV, holding her one-day-old baby, me, and crying because as an Irish Catholic American, she couldn't believe that somebody was finally elected that reflected her beliefs, the same way that many African Americans felt in 2008 when Obama became president. So, what were some of the things that Kennedy promised? He promised to close the missile gap. There was a belief, an erroneous belief, that the Soviets were ahead of us in nuclear weapons and in the space race. Americans feared the Soviets were gaining superiority. Now, this picture here that looks like some weird ball with knitting needles sticking out of it is actually Sputnik, which in 1957 was the first man-made thing into orbit, and they did beat us into space. Here are some of the newspaper headlines from that time. Russia wins the space race. Space age is here. And the United States began to panic that they were getting ahead of us. And remember, at this time period, it was still the Cold War, and there was still that effort to prove that democracy, capitalism, free enterprise was better than communism. And the fact that they had beat us into space was horrifying. Here are two pictures from Kennedy's inaugural address. You have an assignment due Friday where you analyze this. Again, if you look at the picture on the left, there's Kennedy looking extremely young when all the other men are wearing top hats and coats. He insisted on speaking without them, even though it was about 4 degrees. And he and his young wife, Jacqueline, who was only, I think, like 31, rode in this convertible, just the epitome of youth and the infinite possibility of the United States. In his cabinet were 2 people that became well known. He wanted a very strong defense. He appointed this man in the upper left, Robert McNamara, as his Secretary of Defense. And even though President Trump is known for nepotism or appointing people like his daughter and son-in-law to office, JFK was just as bad. The other man in the picture is his brother Robert, who was serving as the Attorney General, the top law enforcement person of the United States. In this picture, you see Robert McNamara, you see the president, and you see his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. And as we know, presidents often try to balance the ticket by putting somebody in as vice president who was different from them. And here is Johnson, who was from Texas, who served in the Congress for years. And he specifically put him as vice president because he thought he might attract some of the southern states that were a little afraid of Kennedy. Would he push civil rights too much? In this photograph, too, you notice him sitting in what has become known as a Boston rocker, which is very common in this part of the country. It has the padded arm and the padded seat because Kennedy suffered, as I mentioned earlier, from lifelong back problems. As a matter of fact, he was addicted to painkillers. And if he were president today, that would never work because presidents usually have their health monitored pretty closely. So when he became president, unlike Eisenhower, who focused a lot of attention on the Mideast, Kennedy focused a lot of attention in Latin America. Cuba was only 90 miles away, and they had had a communist revolution in the late 50s, putting in office Fidel Castro. So Kennedy created what he was called guerrilla warriors. Unlike the traditional Army, Navy, Air Force, etc., he wanted highly trained men who were able to go in a minute and fight guerrilla wars. He also created the U.S. Peace Corps. He proposed a new type of foreign aid. Rather than giving money specifically to help countries fight communism, he thought we could get idealistic young people to go to countries around the globe, especially in Asia and Africa, and teach them how to create schools, how to build wells, to see the benefits of democracy that might help them turn away from communism. He put his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, in charge. The picture in the lower right, the lady on the left that he's talking to, is none other than Eleanor Roosevelt, who became a strong proponent for the Peace Corps. So as I said, volunteers would teach and give technical advice in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Peace Corps is still around today, and it's a highly successful program. There is a picture of Castro, and early in his administration, JFK made a huge mistake. The CIA had created a secret plan to overthrow Castro in Cuba. We trained 1,500 Cuban exiles to infiltrate and land on Cuba as a secret invasion force, and the plan was to land at a remote part of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. And the belief was that the Cubans would rise up and join the exiles to overthrow the communists. It began in April of '61, so as you can see, that was only a few months after JFK took office. It was a complete disaster. Make sure you look at Google Classroom to see the link there. Cuba became aware of the imminent attack and no reinforcements arrived. So the first few months of Kennedy's administration were not going too well. We also saw the building of the Berlin Wall. As you learned, East and West Germany had formed separate governments. The gap continued to widen. People in the West were doing very well economically, enjoying many freedoms, and people in the East were not. So as a result, many East Germans tried to escape to the West. Read this here, that'll give you a few more details. Here's a photo of the beginnings of the Berlin Wall. And if you notice, there's life in West Berlin on the right and life on East Berlin. West Berlin's on the left, East Berlin's on the right. It divided the city in half. And you can notice here the barbed wire, the speakers, the soldiers that became an ever-present divider between the two cities. Here's a photo of an East German guard jumping over the low fence to flee to the west. So the Berlin Wall was built higher and higher. Here's a bunch of pictures of a East German who tried to, or East Berliner, I should say, who tried to escape by the name of Peter Fechter. And he fell and was shot by the East German guards here, and he slowly bled to death. The West German guards knew if they went to get him, they would be shot. And finally, he died and was carried off by East German soldiers. So he became a symbol of this divide. In 1963, President Kennedy visited Berlin, and he gave a famous speech that included these words: "All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner," with my great accent. But he misspoke, and his words translated loosely to, "I am a jelly donut," at which point the Germans, of course, had quite a laugh over this. Here's a photo of Kennedy visiting West Berlin. Virtually every person in West Berlin was there. And his famous quote from this says, "There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin." Now, what you did not see on this PowerPoint is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was arguably the closest the United States has ever come to nuclear war. Please check Google Classroom for information on that. Photos from Camelot.